Well, I think as you've begun to hear, there are two very different kinds of conversations we could have here. We can talk about religion as it is, for most people most of the time, and we can talk about what religion could be, or should be, or perhaps what it is for the tiniest minority of people. And I just want you to be aware of the difference there, because it could get lost. It's true that some people define God as pure consciousness, or as being synonymous with the laws of nature. But if we talk about consciousness and the laws of nature, we won't be talking about the God that most of our neighbors believe in, which is a personal God who hears our prayers and occasionally answers them. So I just want you to be sensitive to this, because if Michael or I say something derogatory about Islam or Christianity, which seems possible, the response from the other side shouldn't mention quantum mechanics. And it shouldn't reference a notion of God that is so denuded of doctrine as to more or less be synonymous with pure mystery or pure information or pure energy or pure anything. So I wanted to plant a flag there where you all can see it, because the God that our neighbors believe in is essentially an invisible person. It's a creator deity who created the universe to have a relationship with one species of primate. Lucky us. and he's got galaxy upon galaxy to attend to, but he's especially concerned with what we do, and he's especially concerned with what we do while naked. And he almost certainly disapproves of homosexuality. And he's created this cosmos as a vast laboratory in which to test our powers of credulity. And the test is this: can you believe in this God on bad evidence? Which is to say, on faith. And if you can, you will win an eternity of happiness after you die. And it's precisely this sort of God and this sort of scheme that you must believe in if you're going to have any kind of future in politics in this country. No matter what your gifts. I mean, you could be an unprecedented genius. You could look like George Clooney. You could have $1 billion, and you could have the social skills of Oprah, and you are going nowhere in politics in this country unless you believe in that sort of God. So we can talk about anything we want. I'm happy to talk about consciousness, but please notice that when we migrate away from the God that is really shaping human events, or the God talk that is really shaping human events in our world at this moment.
What he means by non-local is that everything in the universe is interconnected, and it just is not true. It just isn't.
And there's no reason to think that it's active at the level of the brain. That non-locality is a principle that is working. Hold on, Deepak, you spoke for quite some time. The deeper point to make here, and what is...
But I want to address that brain thing that you just said.
Okay, finish. You might not have to, because the deeper point here, and this is where the whole style and content of what you're saying is so deeply unscientific, is that there's not a physicist sitting on this stage right now. Okay, I would never be tempted to lecture a room full of 1,000 people at Caltech about physics. I'm not a physicist. You're not a physicist. And basically every sentence demonstrates that you speak on the subject. Please don't take this as ad hominem. I mean, I'm talking about specifically what you said. But the fact, what you do, and what many people who try to invoke spooky physics do in the service of propping up their religious and New Age intuitions, is that they think that because what you're saying, because quantum mechanics is spooky and difficult to understand, and because what you're saying is spooky and difficult to understand, they must somehow be related, or they must somehow be mutually supportive. And that's fundamentally not true. They are arrived at by completely different methodologies and ways of thinking and criteria of discursive evidence. What a mystic, I've studied with great mystics. I've met great meditation masters who've spent 20 years in caves perfecting the kinds of techniques of meditation that you would adopt or recommend. They don't know a damn thing about physics. And they're not interested, for the most part, in physics. I mean, there's nothing about sitting in a cave and granted, having incredibly useful and even normative experiences and transforming your way of life and transforming your moment-to-moment perception of the world. There's nothing about that project that makes you a theoretical physicist. And so these are completely different language games. They're completely, and you have just merged them together in a very unprincipled way. And you're getting
well, no, I take resentment at your questioning my scientific credentials. In fact, if anyone on this stage is more scientifically credentialed, it's me. I took physics, chemistry, biology. I'm an MD. I'm a neuroendocrinologist. And I want to object to your saying that brain does not obey. I just want to quote from Einstein. Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind.
And you put up as a meaningless, non-local God.
No, I just said this is also the God that gives us inspiration, insight, creativity, free will, conscious choice making, imagination. Are your neurons doing that, or are you doing that?
As just a point of process here,
well,
could you,
then you're
could you dial it down just a little bit? First of all, I invite everyone to look up that Einstein quote in Ideas and Opinions, read it in context. It'll be absolutely obvious. It can't be pressed into the service that you just witnessed. Einstein complained about this treatment of his metaphorical use of the word God and the few things he said about religion. And you can look that up in Richard Dawkins' book. This is a game. And it's a game that is designed for export to people who don't know much science and don't know how science is done. And you missed the point of, I wasn't criticizing your scientific credentials. You're an endocrinologist. You're an MD. You're not a theoretical physicist. The way science is done is when
theoretical physicists in this audience to actually address these questions.
Okay, so a theoretical physicist will be comfortable talking with real confidence in a very narrow band of his expertise, and he will be exquisitely sensitive to the fact that when he's in a room like this, or she, sorry. I'll just proceed with he just for simplicity's sake here. He will be exquisitely sensitive to the fact that whenever he opens his mouth in a room like this, he is guaranteed to be speaking in front of half a dozen people who know more on any given issue than he does. The great irony of the popular conception of science as arrogant is that when you go to a scientific meeting, you don't see arrogance. I mean, you're about as likely to see real arrogance as you're likely to see nudity at a scientific conference. I mean, this is people are constantly offering caveats and hedges toward what they say. Every statement is couched in, I'm sure there's someone in the room who knows more about this than me, but because everyone is desperate to avoid public embarrassment. Now, this seems to be something you're not doing.
Describe Gene as the expanding circle of sentiments to include women is a result of the Enlightenment experiment that let's try that. Let's see if that produces greater prosperity and wealth and happiness and joy for more people in more places, and it worked. And that's a rational, reasonable approach.
One thing I'd like to add to that is I think it's ironic to score women's rights for your side of the ledger here in this conversation, because there's been no greater obstacle to empowering women in human history than religion. Certainly the three monotheists. I mean, when you...
Sam, to my ear at least, neither Gene nor Deepak is advocating religion as you understand it.
That's true, and that's why I said what I said at the beginning. That the issue here, I mean, what kind of conversation should we have, and how will this conversation be construed by people in the audience, by people seeing this on television? And the reality is that the kind of talk and the kind of invocations of science that Deepak is offering here is received by a great number of people who believe a lot of unjustified very myth-laden stuff that has been handed down to us.
You're making that statement without qualifying it, without giving any proof of it. Give me some proof that what I'm saying is what he says is woo-woo, just because he can't understand it.
Okay.
You know, every discipline has its vocabulary.
It's okay. If you're going to say that non-locality is an operable principle in neuroscience, that is woo-woo right now in neuroscience.
It's that is principle in morphogenesis and differentiation. It's a principle in the workings of the pacemaker of your heart, where 100 pacemaker cells fire simultaneously, non-locally.
Saying it louder and relentlessly is not going to make it true. But I want to get back to answer your question, Dan. I want to get back to something that actually matters. The people, 90% of the people watching this on television will never have heard of non-locality, and if we could explain it to them, they're not going to care about it. They're worried about Jesus. They're worried about the collision with the Muslim world. They're worried about gay marriage. I mean, this is religion talk, and we're talking about the future of God now.
That's the past of God.
Right? Okay, so I'm happy to move on from that, but let's first acknowledge that that's the context. That's why we're having this conversation. The reason why we're talking about God is for the last 4,000 years, people have been handing books to their children saying, all these other books were written by people, but this book is a magic book. It could not possibly have been written by a human being.
I think...
And so now we're here talking about God and the future of God. Gene, so that scheme, I agree with you about that scheme. There are many people having these remarkable experiences in every traditional context. That, in and of itself, proves that all of these religions are wrong. All of these religions claim their exclusive validity. And the fact that you have Christians having deep experiences of peace, and you have Muslims, and you have atheists, and you have Buddhists, it proves that there's a deeper principle that should be talked about in a non-sectarian way that is not held hostage by Iron Age literature. I mean, that... Okay,
No, that's a very important point.
We need a scientific discourse on the possibilities of human well-being.
Sure.
And you can get as esoteric as you want there. You can talk about self-transcendence. You can talk about the ego being an illusion. You can ask, what is the relationship between consciousness and the rest of the physical world? And the truth is, when you get out to some of those fringe areas, you are getting to an area of real scientific ignorance. And the first thing you want to do in the spirit of intellectual honesty is admit ignorance, not claim that you, by closing your eyes, can realize your identity with the entire cosmos and the origin of you go get before the Big Bang with your unguarded intuitions. I mean, that's not how you discover what happened.
And it's also seeing the changing of the story in its mythic structure. The story is moving, I believe, from my experience around the world. I think it's moving to men and women together as part of the heroic journey. I think it's moving to people in many, many different cultures, and it is about the saving, if you will, of this beautiful planet in this, its most critical moment in human history. And that's the new story.
Gene, you know that nowhere in human discourse is there a greater impediment to changing the story than in religion. I mean, the story doesn't change. The Ramayana is not going to get rewritten based on that conversation.
You're talking about cultural mythology, not religion.
I'm talking
about
the Bible, the Quran.
That's all cultural mythology.
The organizing doctrines by which 99% of the people on earth who call themselves religious
Still
are
the past. Still the past.
Lives.
We have the internet. We have ABC News. We can change that conversation.
Yeah, that is the purpose of conversations like this. But it seems to me that if you want to move forward and reinvent God and actually have it be relevant to people and have your word God, I mean, I don't know why you'd be tempted to use the word God. If in
Generation,
fact you
organization, delivery.
Please. It seems to me that you are happily being misunderstood in your use of the word God. You know that
actually sad
that vast numbers of people care about God for a multiplicity of reasons, most of which you don't want to defend on this stage. But why use the word God? Why not just talk about
I just told you it's an acronym.
No, Deepak.
Well, I have to say, Sorry for being so combative. That was because of Michael Shermer, but I actually agree. I actually agree with almost everything you've said, Sam. I have no disagreement with the deeper truth that you're hinting at. I am just saying is that this conversation needs to take place in a setting such as this, where it can lead to other conversations, so that this is not a debate but a dialectic, where through these contradictory points of view, we arrive at a greater truth.
Okay. But you are carrying around a tremendous amount of ballast from the past, and you are describing it as somehow necessary equipment. So, for instance, you talked about these great wisdom traditions that he is so callously dismissed out of his own ignorance. You go to these great wisdom traditions, right? And you consult. I mean, and you're talking about changing the story. And so, what does it mean to change the story in Islam? Let's just talk about facts. You open the Quran. In the 4th chapter, it says disobedient wives should be whipped by their husbands. Okay, so this is what
it says that in the Old Testament, all kinds of things. It says that
absolutely
in
does.
the Hindu book
Deepak, I'm just picking Islam as an example.
Why? It's true of all religions.
Okay, then I can pick Judaism. Would you be more comfortable if I pick Judaism as an example? It's the same. Yes, all of these books are litanies of barbarous practices. But the point is that the way Muslims are now constrained to change the story is they can't change the Quran. The Quran is the perfect word of the creator of the universe. They have to parse the word whipped, and the most enlightened of them have to say things like, well, it doesn't actually mean you take out the bullwhip and you whip her. It could be a kind of a ceremonial kind of patting, just a brief chastisement that doesn't actually hurt. And so you get a range, but nowhere in that range do you get real equity and real compassion and real understanding between the sexes. And to get that, you have to admit, okay, this is barbarous nonsense that we should just disregard. And religion doesn't give you the tools to do that. And God talk is either profoundly misleading or unhelpful, or it's just part of the problem. Okay, well, I think we should wander off the specifics of oxytocin. He's just described an experiment where you can actually answer that question. If I give you a shot of oxytocin and it changes your level of trust, then it's not just mere correlation. I mean, we've run it both ways.
But I can increase trust, and it can generate oxytocin too.
But if trust is just the brain in one state, then you have the brain influencing its future states. You haven't gotten out of the brain and got an ectoplasm.
Trust is the subjective experience of consciousness. Oxytocin is the objective experience of consciousness.
But what you seem to be expressing is a deeper skepticism about whether the brain is even involved.
No, the brain is involved. No, your consciousness likes brains to express itself.
Okay, but do you believe, for instance, do you believe that do we have souls, or that our mind is somehow independent of the brain, that it'll lift off the brain at death and go elsewhere?
I believe there's a transcendent core consciousness that is comprised of meanings, context, relationships, archetypal ideas that recycles itself, just like everything else recycles itself.
So it's in no sense a product of the brain.
It's no sense a product of the brain, and our whole endeavor in spiritual discipline is to actually go beyond that personal consciousness, that ego consciousness, so we can identify with that transcendent reality, which is the source of space, time, energy, and everything else that exists.
Okay, well, let me just say a few things.
No, but I think the question is, are we encapsulated bags of skin dragging around a very little ego?
No,
or are we organism
really
symbiotic
you
with
can
fields
say no
within
to
fields
that.
and consciousness of life?
Deepak, let me just you put a lot on the table. So Deepak just said some very seems a strange word to use, but some concrete things that science can criticize. Okay, you just said that consciousness and mind are.
I didn't say consciousness and mind. I said mind is a product of consciousness.
Okay, but this subjectivity is independent of the objectivity of the brain.
There is a subjectivity which is independent of objects. But there's a subjectivity which is subjectivity of itself. When you're looking at the brain for consciousness, you're not looking at consciousness, you're looking at synaptic firings. In fact,
Yes,
it is your
yes,
consciousness that is looking
Okay.
at those synaptic
Okay.
firings.
All right. Let's just keep that in view. All right. Now you've said there are two things that an incomplete science of consciousness and the mind should want to say about that. One is that having an experience of undivided consciousness does not tell you what consciousness really is or what its relationship to the brain really is. There's nothing about introspection that leads you to sense that your subjectivity is at all dependent or even related to voltage changes and chemical interactions going on inside your head. Okay, you can feel, you can drop acid, you can meditate for a year, you can do whatever you want to perturb your nervous system. You can feel yourself to be one with the universe, and at no point in that transformation do you get a glimpse that there's 100 trillion neurons in your head or synapses in your head that are doing anything.
It's called binding.
No, it's not. It's called absolute subjective ignorance of what's actually going on outside the consciousness.
You're
You're so Deepak,
you're so dismissive of subjective experience.
I'm not remotely dismissive of it.
To poetry, to music, to art. So dismissive of subjectivity. I'm saying that the whole universe is imbued with subjectivity.
There's nothing more important than subjectivity. It's all we could possibly care about. The fabric of our experience, the changes in our conscious experience, are all we care about. And they have some relation to the physical universe.
Absolutely.
Okay, now the question is...
They give rise to the physical universe.
Okay, that is a statement of metaphysics that is totally unjustified and cannot possibly be justified.
That's why it's a statement of metaphysics, not of physics.
No, metaphysical statements also have to be justified, as it turns out.
Ethics and love and compassion and empathy are all, and tell me if I'm wrong here, evidence that can be marshaled in support of an argument for divine.
It is impossible, and Roger Penrose and John Searle would substantiate this. It is impossible for a physical system, no matter how complex it is, to process meaning, to process creativity, to process purpose, to process even, you can map that out, you can show the molecules there, but it is impossible for a physical system to feel those qualities.
Okay, that's simply not true. It's what is true to say is that we don't understand how that is being accomplished, and even I'll give you even more than that. We don't understand what the relationship between consciousness and matter is. Now, for instance, if electrons,
I'll grant you that, by the way, what you just corrected me on.
But it's not. There's no reason. It gets you nothing to say it's impossible in science.
Well, I'm saying that very prominent researchers like John Searle and Roger Penrose have made those explicit statements.
Okay, but they're in a much larger conversation. They have more detractors than could fit in this hall. These are areas of genuine scientific uncertainty. But what is obvious is that the way to clarify this domain is not to pretend to know things you don't know.
Well, I'm sorry.
And you're saying. I want to bring Gene in.
Yeah, I just want to say I'm sorry if I gave the impression that I don't know, that I pretend to know things that I don't know. I'm just offering a possible hypothesis. That's why we're calling it the future of God. And I stand corrected.
Okay, so when you say,
I'd like to talk about this.
If I could just tie him down to this one statement, though, because this seems like new information. Okay. If you're saying that when you say we are on a continuum, the consciousness that I experience in myself is the creator of the universe, which you said about 5 minutes ago.
You see, creator is a very anthropomorphic.
Okay, I just want, however you said it, is that a hypothesis, or because you said it as just a blanket assertion, this is a fact?
I think
that I'm ignorant of.
See, there are three ways of knowing. One is through empirical observation, what we call the eyes of the flesh. Then there's a deeper knowing, comes from the eyes of the mind. If I want to understand the theorem of Pythagoras, it's activity of the mind. Why does mathematics, for example, describe so precisely the activity of nature? It's one of the most astounding puzzles of the universe. And then there is a deeper knowing, which is the eyes of the soul. What's his name? William Blake said, we are led to believe a lie when we see with and not through the eye, that was born in a night to perish in a night, while the soul slept in beams of light. So what I'm saying is,
but that's why William Blake is not a great scientist.
Of knowing. Belief has a brain chemistry to it. There's no question about
Right, but you would argue that it's not just that.
I have never defended belief. I started out by saying that belief is a cover-up for insecurity.
Forget about belief. Just human experience is everything is contained in what you mean by just. Okay, does just mean you're taking all of the meaning out of life and just deflating us to a puddle of randomly aggregated proteins that have nothing of what interests a human being through the course of his or her life. And many people assume that a completed scientific understanding of ourselves would somehow amount to that we're just atoms in some temporary arrangement, and everything that we love out of life, including love, it can't be captured by that. And that's just not what science is.
Would you agree, and I think you're almost saying that nothing but, to say something nothing but is never true. It's always both and plus much, much more. And I think we're looking at what is the much, much more.
Yeah,
when
but what you're tending to do with
arenas.
the much, much more, I think, is profoundly misleading.
Yes.
I mean, that's the rub here.
Say that again, I'm sorry.
He says what you're tending to do with the much, much more is profoundly misleading.
And worse than that, and I'm not just talking about you, I'm talking about people, worse than that, it is on a continuum with what the really religiously infatuated and dogmatic are doing, and because you're using the same words.
Scientifically dogmatic and infatuated.
But like that move itself is, I mean, so you can say, you can talk about scientific fundamentalism as the corollary of religious fundamentalism. That's just a trick with words. There is no scientific fundamentalism that is analogous to religious fundamentalism. But that's a separate issue.
I think. But by the way,
if I could just finish this point, the fact that you use words like God and faith with such enthusiasm puts you in you are the shade under which all of these really barbarous forms of religiosity still relax and luxuriate and thrive because you. And I don't mean you personally, I mean religious liberals, moderates, New Age types who still want to talk about God and faith and not differentiate what they're saying from the rest of God talk, which is really what is shaping our conversation about religion in this country and in this world.
Help me, dear scientists, to understand why we have this deep yearning. Why do we have this deep longing to understand the nature of the beginnings of the universe? Why do we have this deep yearning and longing to understand ourselves? Help me, if you can help me as a scientist to explain why this is built into the scheme of evolution, or does evolution have to do anything, I am here to be enlightened.
Sam, what do you say to that?
Well, I think it's we don't all have this deep yearning. I mean, that's rather obvious. If you took the 100,000 people on planet Earth at this moment who felt this deep yearning to understand our place in the universe most acutely, and you dispatch them, we would be left without a lot of people thinking about the origins of the universe in any real sense.
What do you think people are doing on Sunday morning all over this country?
What was that?
What are people doing on Sunday mornings at 11 o'clock all over this country? They're thinking about that issue.
They're not thinking about, I mean, cosmology is not their concern.
Well, they might not call it cosmology, but they are thinking about why we're here and what we're supposed to do.
I'm sorry,
Deepak, let me just finish. On Sunday morning,
right,
or Friday afternoon, or Friday night, depending on when you worship, whether you want to call it cosmology, or whatever you want to call it, people are there to ask the basic questions. Who are we? Why are we here? What are we supposed to be doing?
I was responding to what Deepak was saying.
But I think that's what it was saying.
People want to be happy. They know the difference between happiness and suffering. They want to feel a part of a community. They want to feel the best they've ever felt and, better than they've ever felt. And they constantly notice that life makes that difficult. And our spiritual traditions are our response to that circumstance, and our beliefs, the beliefs that console us about what happens after death, are obviously a response to that circumstance. I mean, your child dies. What you're immediately confronted with is, what can I now do to not suffer this way for the rest of my life? And one thing people have found to do is tell each other a story that death is an illusion, that we all get together at the right hand of Jesus after we die. That does the trick for a lot of people, and people are mightily attached to that story. But that story is really both in its products and in the way of getting there, the antithesis of the scientific frame of mind. And we just can't conflate them. And we have to notice when we're lying to ourselves and when we're lying to our children. And we have to notice that there's a liability to pretending to know things we don't know.
A long time ago, religion made a pact with science, with Mr. Descartes, I guess his name was, and where he didn't want to be burnt at the stake, so he agreed with religion that religion would take over the spiritual aspect and questions regarding, God or the higher being, and science would relegate itself to the physical. My question is, when is science going to forget Descartes and start focusing on, what creates evil, for instance, and those things that have been relegated to religion? Why doesn't science now start focusing in that direction so that we can get a clearer picture of things?
The higher up you go, from neurons all the way up to people in an economy or a political system, wow, is that complex. This is a really hard problem. So we need to really apply science, exactly like you suggest.
But on this point of evil, sometimes there's not more than just the neurons, because we know, for instance, that the brains of psychopaths are damaged in ways that we're now increasingly understanding. People are scanning the brains of people who rate very highly on the psychopathy scale. But the classically evil people, the people who don't feel empathy for their victims, who like torturing and killing people. This is something we're increasingly understanding at the level of the brain, and we know the various regions of the frontal lobe that have characteristic pathology in psychopaths, and no doubt at some point we'll understand that in much greater detail. Now, there are many different, that doesn't mean evil is really just this region of the brain damaged. There's much more that can be said about human evil, but it has neural correlates, and if you damage the part of the brain that mediates feelings of empathy, that person won't feel empathy anymore. And that is a causal fact, which we are now in a position to appreciate. So
Michael and Sam, how do you respond when you hear a testimonial like that?
Well, first let me say I didn't hear it in every detail, but I think I got the sense of it. He was saying he was greatly helped by Deepak's techniques of meditation?
Correct.
Okay. Well,
he was very sick, and that Deepak's meditation helped him.
Well, there's no question that if the mind is just what the brain is doing, and again I say if, I mean it's possible that there's more to be said about the mind, but if it is just the brain, what the brain is doing, well then there's no mystery that there's a mind-brain relationship, because it's all the body. So neurophysiology is affecting the functioning of the body on many levels, is affecting the immune system. Stress affects the brain. Genes are transcribed in response to stress. I mean, all of this is a system. And some people want to argue that the system is not enough to account for human experience, but the science is very much unwritten and open-ended on that subject, and we simply don't know all the details. But there's no question people have remarkable experiences practicing meditation, changing their moment-to-moment thoughts about themselves. And if this is what the brain is doing, and there are many reasons to think that it is what the brain is doing, it of course has changes reflected.
So are you saying it's the unknown? But it's not necessarily the divine.
None of that diminishes. I mean, for instance, the placebo effect. We know the placebo effect for many conditions is really robust. I mean, you can give someone a pill that is just has absolutely no medical potential in it at all, and they will feel much better. And so it's possible to have one's expectation of medicine really transform the way one feels.
And changing biology.
Okay, so yeah, that's a potential of the human mind, and it is a potential of the human brain, and we need to understand that. But none of that requires that we pretend to know things we don't know. Again, this is it's a play on words. Whenever you're talking about scientific fundamentalism or diabolical science, we have a problem with technology. Much of our technology can be extremely destructive, and in the wrong hands, and rather often those hands are religious hands. It becomes incredibly dangerous. So we have people with 14th century worldviews who now have access to incredibly destructive technology.
Almost out of time.
But
so I'm gonna do my best.
this is the point to take on board. The remedy, there's such a thing as bad science. There's such a thing as scientific fraud. There's such a thing as incomplete science. The remedy for all of those things is more science and better science and further scientific discussion. It is never religion.
My question is a bit of a follow-on to the last one, but is primarily directed towards Sam. Sam, from the perspective of a neuroscientist and knowing what we know today about the hardwiring as well as the other structures in the brain, the neurochemistry, as to our inherent bias toward wanting a causal explanation for what we see and experience around us, whether God actually exists or not in any of the organized or unorganized discussions that we've had with God, don't you feel that a belief in God is, from a neurochemical or structural basis, inevitable?
Well, apparently not. I've got a sample of at least one that I'm pretty sure about.
You want to go back on him, Adam, on that? Or?
Yes, I'd say secondarily, based on our need for tribes and society, don't you feel that, again, the belief that there is no God is going to, from our own structured creation, not discussing what the cause of that creation was, but don't you feel that we're just biased in such a way that in society we will always have the belief in God as the major belief, and the belief that there is no God as a minor and presently not very vocal understanding?
Yeah, it's an interestingly provincial point of view. That we're in America, which is almost functionally a theocracy. But in Western Europe, your question actually wouldn't make sense right now. I mean, it is a massively secular part of the world, and if you go to Scandinavia, it flips entirely. It's something like a majority, 60 to, depending on how you ask the question, 60 to 80% of people in Denmark, for instance, are atheists. I mean, they do not believe. They treat the God of Abraham the way we treat Zeus, and that is, just refresh the browser in your brain and realize that those are actually equivalent. And we are in a shocking circumstance where most people in our society are really worried about Zeus. And you pick up the New York Times tomorrow, and I guarantee you that the international section of the paper will more or less read like, what are the crazy Muslims doing today? But if you realize that what they're doing is on the basis of a belief that is just like a belief in the gods of Mount Olympus. I mean, imagine if you drawing cartoons of Hercules could get you killed. Actually, I think I want to treat the question that was asked by the woman who asked about near-death experience and the use of the word light in the Old Testament. Because it seems to me really to come back to the books in terms of general relevance to world events. We are really prisoners of literature right now. We are constrained to talk either explicitly about these books or in some vague conformity to these books. And These books were written by people every person in this room has more access to information and scientific knowledge and just what is now basic common sense than the authors of the Bible and the Quran. And in fact, there's not a person in this room who has ever met a person whose worldview is as narrow, just by the sheer time in which they appeared in history, as the worldviews of Abraham or Moses or Jesus or Muhammad. And until we grapple with that fact and honestly talk about honestly commit ourselves to a 21st century conversation about the possibilities of human well-being, we're just going to be at sea, and we're going to be trying to figure out whether we should pass laws about gay marriage and whether we should ban blasphemy at the UN and whether we should allow newspapers to print cartoons about the Prophet Muhammad. And we're going to just be bewildered by the relentless certainties of people who are